between these two things, between belief and articulation, grows even tighter. You remember when Moses descends Mount Sinai. He's lugging those 2 stone tablets. And they contain 10 phrases, which would become Israel's watchwords. It's a curious list if you stop to read them. Coveting, that's out. Stealing, no good. Adultery, not a great idea. But when God decides to issue a law in this story about words, God issues not 1 command but 2. Isn't that interesting? That the power of words gets double the attention even in the 10 Commandments. It says, do not bear false witness against your brother or sister, which is really just a fancy way of saying that hate speech and slander and lying are all bad news. And do not use the Lord's name in vain, which is to say that when you speak God, you should do it thoughtfully, intentionally, not carelessly. You continue to read the Old Testament, what do you find? You find that Israel is primarily, in the words of theologian Walter Brueggemann, a community of utterance. That they begin to pass stories along, to talk about God, to remember God using their words. You find the prophets are judged by the words they choose to use or the words that they choose to withhold. Over and over we find God using words to shape people, to change people, to interact with people, to intersect this kind of earthly realm. You remember the story of the prophet Elijah who goes up on Mount Horeb, and it says that he's climbing this mountain and he's sitting there and he's waiting for God, and there's this fire that sweeps across the mountain, but God was not in the fire. And there's a mighty wind that goes across the face of the mountain. It says, but God was not in the wind. And an earthquake rumbles and it shakes the foundation of the mountain, but God was not in the earthquake. And then God comes. And how does God come? In a still, small voice. In words. In fact, if you read the text, you find almost every time God does something new, it happens with a linguistic miracle. It happens with words. So it shouldn't surprise us that by the time Jesus arrives on the scene, this connection between spirituality and speech is sort of reinforced. Jesus launches his ministry in his hometown synagogue saying, I have been anointed by God to proclaim, which is to say, to speak God. And Jesus' 3 years of ministry was first and foremost a ministry of words. He would say, come follow me. He'd say, your faith has healed you. He'd say, go and sin no more. Blessed are the meek. And with every proclamation, doors would swing wide open, and lame legs would dance, and blind eyes would see. Jesus loved language so much, you often find him in the New Testament issuing odes to linguistics. Jesus said that good people will use life-giving words. He taught that we will have to justify the way we speak in the afterlife. Jesus said that human beings can't live by bread alone, but by nourishment from divine syllables. So it's no surprise then that the very last thing Jesus says in the Gospels to his disciples is to go therefore into all the world and speak God. So when we encounter Paul in 2 Corinthians, and Paul says, we believe, therefore we speak, we begin to realize that Paul is entering into a tradition that we have lost largely, that connects together this spirituality, this spiritual realm, the things that we are experiencing, our own inner life, and the act of speaking. We believe, therefore we speak. But in a world like ours, that's easier said than done, isn't it? Speaking about what we believe. We often struggle in the 21st century, to have spiritual or religious conversations with our friends and our family members and our neighbors and our coworkers, don't we? It's not so easy. I first encountered this struggle myself 5 years ago when I relocated from the Bible Belt to New York City. Prior to the move, I'd resided in a suburban neighborhood outside of Atlanta. It was a place where almost all my friends were Christian. Almost all of us actually went to the same church. In this world, there was kind of a cultural Christian lingo that almost everybody spoke, and basically everybody else understood. Most of you know this, right? I mean, you grew up in the Deep South and somebody sneezes, and what does somebody say? God bless you. And the person who's sneezing doesn't stop and say, what do you mean by God or bless? They don't need a follow-up question. We all kind of understand what's going on, right? That's why somebody new moves to town, you might ask them where they go to church rather than if they do. So I grew up in this world using religious language with ease, rarely pausing to think about what my words meant. But I was not in Georgia anymore. I'd moved to New York City. And New York City was a different kind of culture, a post-Christian culture. I'd written about a post-Christian culture for a long time, but what I was starting to realize is it's a lot easier to write about than it is to live in one. In New York, religious fluency is not assumed. The majority of residents do not attend church on any given Sunday, and as I quickly discovered, many people didn't understand the sacred words that I'd taken for granted. Others used them, but with wildly different meanings. My first Sunday in New York, I remember I was standing on a subway platform heading to go visit a church, and a woman asked me where I was going, and I said, I'm heading to go to a worship service. She asked for clarification. She didn't really understand what that word meant. I said, well, I'm going to a church. I just moved to New York, and I was going to visit a new congregation. Well, she perked up and said, well, great. She said she understood. She practiced the Baha'i faith. She held up her crystal amulet necklace and explained it protected her from evil spirits and said if I was spiritually curious, she could read my chakra, the invisible energy fields around my body. And here I was, this southerner in New York City, and we're talking about our respective religious practices, and it became pretty clear that neither of us really understood what the other person was saying. She peppered me with all kinds of questions about God, the Bible, and the afterlife, and I was just fumbling for answers. Every time I would use a word that I considered to be common, a word like grace or gospel, she would ask me for clarification, please. And I'm stuttering and fumbling and stammering, each time trying to rephrase what I meant in ordinary vernacular, but I couldn't seem to articulate their meanings. It was like trying to define the word color or the word thee. Words we use all the time, but if you stop to think about what they actually mean, you're not so sure you can explain it. And that's the way I think most of us speak God. We're just sort of using words passively, rarely stopping to ask, what am I saying when I'm saying what I'm saying? What am I really saying when I'm saying what I'm saying about God, about faith, about spirituality? Now, of course, not all people are like this woman, I came to realize. Many people understand sacred terms, but they have experienced them as a source of judgment, pain, coercion. A friend in my co-working space asked me whether I was like the hypocritical Christians he saw on TV, and I didn't really have an answer for that. I could understand the way that he felt. The way many people speak God these days kind of makes even those of us who fancy ourselves spiritual people sort of shrink back. We don't want to be associated with that. Sacred phrases become tools of manipulation in the hands of angry religious leaders. They're fashioned into clubs by combative evangelists. They are transformed into partisan stump speeches by political preachers. And when shouted outside of a football stadium, by a man with a bullhorn and a sandwich board, even the words of Scripture become just downright annoying. I started to catch on to a pattern emerging in my conversation after I'd been in New York only a few months. I started to realize that I could have conversation with most of my friends and my neighbors and my coworkers so long as we stuck to benign topics. But the moment things turned spiritual, I began to struggle to really explain what I thought and what I believed. to avoid having to define all these terms or to avoid feeling embarrassment for believing what I believed, I just avoided these conversations altogether. Well, you know what? I'm not alone. Because I'm meeting people from all over the country in places even like this, yes, who also feel that they've been struck mute in a strange land. They've woken up and seen a world, a society, a culture that they don't really feel like they fit into anymore. And they don't know how to kind of express what they think and feel and believe outside of places like this. Terms like sin or evil have become so negative, they get stuck in our throats. Other words like belief or salvation, well, we've used those so often we don't even know what they mean anymore. See, you don't have to move to New York City to feel these tensions. We're all now connected with the internet and Facebook. We're encountering people every day who differ from us in race and religion, gender identity, sexual orientation, cultural mores. No matter where you live, in neighborhoods all across America, people aren't reading from the same script. They're not working from a common spiritual vocabulary. So it doesn't matter if you're living in a Rocky Mountain mining town, on a bungalow on the beach, or in Morgantown, Kentucky. And I bet if I asked many of you would say you've run into an awkward language barrier in recent days. Maybe you were spoon-fed religious words since infancy. But as you've matured, you wonder if maybe some of those terms need to mature with you. Maybe you once believed that accepting faith was as easy as praying certain words, but now you've come to realize it's a little more complicated than that. Maybe the rigid religious tradition that you grew up in has made you so anxious about having all the right answers that you end up not saying anything at all. Maybe your parents or your pastors, your friends, have used religious words to shame you or scold you, oppress you or repress you. Maybe you've been turned off by the sharp syllables of street preachers, the slick pitches of televangelists, and the trite words of pious politicians. Maybe you feel guilty speaking God because if you're honest, if you're really, really honest, deep down, you're only kind of probably sure God exists, like on even-numbered days. Maybe you squirm when you hear people use religious language to convert others without ever considering maybe they're the ones who need to be converted. Maybe you still walk into a church like this most weeks, but you object to some of the words you hear spoken while you're here. If that's you, you're in good company. When I got to New York, I decided to conduct a national survey to see what was really happening. And you know what I found? I talked to over 1,000 Americans and found out that millions of us, actually 2/3 of Americans, say they don't talk about their faith regularly. Only 7% of Americans, despite the fact that 71% of us claim to be Christian, only 7% of Americans say that they have a spiritual or religious conversation on a regular basis. And that includes only 1 in 8 church-going Christians. That means if all of you are like the most faithful, you show up here on a regular basis, 7 out of 8 of you will not have a conversation about faith until you come back in this room next week. Think about that. We believe, but we do not therefore speak. We've lost our therefore. We've lost that connection between belief and articulation. Something has happened. Something is sort of fritzed out. The wiring has gone bad. And why are so many of us tongue-tied? Well, according to my poll, there were a range of reasons. More than a quarter of people say that religious conversations always seem to create tension or arguments. And of course, if you've ever been at Thanksgiving dinner and Uncle Philip is shaking a drumstick at you, telling you what the Bible really says, you know how that feels. You think, I don't really want to have that conversation. Many people say that religious words have become too politicized. Have you watched cable news lately? We live in an era now where politicians talk like preachers and preachers talk like politicians, and it all gets very confusing. And so you end up saying, I don't know that I want